Hello, my name is Andy Kletch, designated broker of RSVP Real Estate. Today we're going to talk about the complete Form 17. Now, we know this can be an issue, so we wanted to provide a little clarity in regards to the Form 17 and the issues surrounding it and it being properly filled out. So let's get right to it. Alongside me is our legal mind, Sam Myler, to provide a little more background and clarity for the proper filling out of Form 17. So, Sam, what is the importance and the reasoning behind Form 17?
Well, Andy, in a transaction for the sale of residential real property, the RCW requires the seller to deliver to the buyer a completed seller statement that discloses the property's condition. It's statutorily required unless the exception applies or the buyer waives receipt. The seller's failure to comply, unless the buyer has expressly waived the right, entitles the buyer to rescind the contract. The seller disclosure statement evolved in Washington State as a risk management tool to protect sellers and the real estate licensees who represent them, as well as to inform purchasers of actual problems with the property. Completing the Form 17 thoroughly and honestly can help avoid disputes and lawsuits after the sale.
Well, so all that being said, Sam, when acting as a listing broker, if the Form 17 is incomplete, then why is it important to send written communication to our sellers requesting that they complete it?
Well, Form 17 and the RCW both state, please complete the following form. Do not leave any spaces blank. If the question clearly does not apply to the property, write NA for not applicable. RCW states if the seller fails or refuses to provide the disclosure statement as required, the prospective buyer's right of rescission shall apply until the earlier of 3 business days after receipt of the disclosure statement or the date that the sale closed, unless the buyer has otherwise waived that right of rescission in writing. The law requires that a seller respond to every question: yes, no, don't know, or NA if the question clearly does not apply. Although there are only 3 boxes next to each question on Form 17 for yes, no, or don't know, the sellers are still required to write in NA if the question doesn't apply. If there are questions that are left unanswered, even if the responses would have been NA, then arguably the seller hasn't completed the disclosure statement as specifically required by the RCW in Form 17, and the buyer may have the right to rescind until the closing. This is important because writing in NA if the question doesn't apply confirms that the question truly doesn't apply and that the seller didn't just skip that question or forget to answer that question. Filling in NA avoids uncertainty and avoids mistakes.
So that advice very much so then is for the protection of our sellers. Now, if the seller chooses not to make any changes, then what is our duty then as the listing broker?
Well, you satisfy your duty as a listing broker as long as you've advised the client that they are required to deliver to the buyer a completed seller disclosure statement. You want to advise your client. This does not mean completing the form for them or telling them how they should respond to any specific question.
Now, switching over when we're representing a buyer. In many instances, we know the listing firm sends you an incomplete Form 17. So then why is it important to send that written communication over to the listing broker requesting that the seller completely fill out the Form 17?
The purchase of a home, as we all know, is one of the largest and most important purchases that most people will ever make in their lives. They're entitled to a complete Form 17, they being the buyer, so that they can make an informed decision. If the Form 17 isn't complete, you, as a broker, do not necessarily know how the seller would have actually answered that question that's left blank. Did they intentionally leave it blank? Did they accidentally skip it? Your client has the right to know, and you're working for them.
Right, and so we're not going to just assume that the seller made the right response. So then our process is to follow up and to make one written attempt to the listing broker. So why is that one written attempt to the listing broker important?
Well, you owe a duty of reasonable skill and care to your client. Making sure that you've documented that effort of showing that reasonable skill and care to get your client a completed Form 17 like they're entitled to is important so that you are protecting yourself and protecting your client.
So in many instances, the response we know you have received or will receive from the listing broker is those questions are only required to be answered when that primary question is marked with a yes. Well, then the seller checked no. So why is it important to request that the seller answer those follow-up questions even when it might appear to you or the listing broker to the seller that they clearly do not apply?
Well, yeah, it's important because obtaining a full and complete Form 17 avoids uncertainty and avoids disputes. Again, you might think you know why the seller left that question blank, but what if it was a mistake? What if they weren't sure how to respond to the question and were planning on going back and simply forgot to? Unless the letters NA for not applicable appear next to that question, do you really know for certain that the seller left it blank because they were planning on answering the question as not applicable? Your buyer clients are entitled to a complete Form 17, and unless an exception applies or they expressly waive it, they're entitled to it, and you should do your best in pursuing it for the benefit of your client.
So all just in for the proper representation and the benefit of our client. So, in so many cases, sellers and the listing broker replies that the Form 17 is in fact complete. So, we've told our buyer client, this is what we're going to get. What is a good process for RSVP selling brokers when that happens?
Point the broker to the language of Form 17 and let them know that the form is incomplete. Form 17 expressly states, do not leave any spaces blank. If the question clearly does not apply to the property, write NA. It's hard to argue when the language is so clear on the form.
So now we've made the one documented request. The seller either completes it or sends it back stating this is all we're going to do. You're not getting anything else. So now basically then it's up to the buyer to figure out, do they want to proceed or not?
That's correct. It's up to the buyer at that point to determine how they're going to respond and if they're going to request a full Form 17. The buyer has options on whether they are going to accept the form as has been presented or if they're going to take a hard stand and say, I need that completed Form 17.
But then ultimately you've done your duty as a broker.
That's right.
In summary, when you are the listing broker, you only need to make one written, documented attempt to your client requesting they conform with the RCW and answer each question on the Form 17. The text for this email has been provided on the RSVP Broker blog. Look on the left side in the category list for Form 17. After you send the email to your seller, this must be forwarded into SkySlope for your documentation purposes. And that is it. You are done. When you are the buyer's broker, same as the listing broker, again, you only need to make one written attempt to the seller requesting they conform with the RCW by answering each question and checking a box or writing in NA. Text for the email to the listing broker can also be found in the same Form 17 category within the RSVP blog. If the seller provides a complete revised Form 17, then forward it to your buyer client. If the seller refuses to provide a complete Form 17, copy and paste the text for the second buyer email found in the Form 17 category in the broker blog and send that email to your buyer client. These emails must also be forwarded into SkySlope. As a reminder, there's no verbal agreements in real estate. Emails provide the documentation, and SkySlope provides the document retention needed. As always, please let us know if you have any questions. For Sam Myler, I'm Andy Clutch, hoping this provides a little clarification and wishing you all the best in getting complete Form 17s.